Hey everyone, I'm Steve from gamersnexus.net, and first of all, check out the new set, pretty sweet. So today we're talking about HDMI as an interface, hopefully debunking a couple of myths, answering some questions surrounding HDMI because it can be a bit confusing with all the different video interfaces out there. First of all, what is HDMI? HDMI is a video interface that can transmit, interestingly, video data. It can also do audio data, and it can do data. So when I say that, I mean if you have a USB interface on your device, monitor, TV, or otherwise, HDMI is capable of transmitting, receiving data through the HDMI interface for USB devices or similar devices. HDMI can also do this for audio. If your monitor has speakers built into it, instead of using a 3.5 millimeter jack, you can actually tell the computer and monitor to communicate with one another using audio down the HDMI cable. So the main advantage here is that it makes cabling a bit simpler if you're using a setup like that. Now, HDMI at a more spec level is a 19-pin interface. You can see a chart of that here. And the pinout includes a lot of pins for what's called TMDS lines. So what is TMDS? TMDS stands for Transition Minimized Differential Signaling. And what that means is it's a method for reducing EMI, crosstalk, things like that. And this is done by taking a signal, splitting it down two lines, two wires, and one is positive, one is negative. At the end of the line, when they are merged again into one signal, there's effectively a parity check where the system can look at it, say this data is static data or EMI or interference, impedance, crosstalk, whatever you want to call it, and does not belong in the signal and will muddy our resulting image or audio or what have you. And TMDS takes that, looks at it, strips out anything that does not belong, and then you get your cleaner signal. So that's what those do. There are 3 TMDS channels in HDMI 2.0, which is the most recent HDMI interface. HDMI 2.0 with 3 TMDS channels, each one is capable of doing 6 gigabits per second, so you have an 18 gigabits per second, 6 times 3, total throughput potential on HDMI 2.0 as an interface. For comparison purposes, HDMI 1.4 and 1.4b, which are among the most prominent interfaces on the recent market, are capable of doing 10.2 gigabits per second with a 340 megahertz pixel clock. The HDMI 2.0 pixel clock is 600 megahertz, and this is actually really important for high resolution gaming, and we're going to talk about why right now. To see how useful that 600 megahertz pixel clock is, we can do some basic math. Take a 4K display as an example. That is 4096 pixels by 2160 pixels. You multiply those, you get about 8.8 million pixels, give or take a couple at the end there. And 8.8 million pixels is a lot of data being transmitted. It's doing that every frame. There are 60 frames per second, or 60 hertz in this case. We have a refresh rate, 60 times per second times 8.8 million equals about 530 million. 530 million, or 530 megahertz, fits within our 600 megahertz budget for the pixel clock on HDMI 2.0 as an interface. So that means that in this instance, we're capable of transmitting 4K at 60 hertz, which was the big deal with the HDMI 2.0 launch. Now, for HDMI 1.4, there is a common misconception where users perceive that the interface is capable of transmitting a 1080p output at 120 hertz. This is true and not true at the same time. So to clarify things for everyone, it is capable of doing 1080p at 120 hertz, but only for 3D, and that's because it's cloning the data packet and you're stacking it for three-dimensional use if you're doing some kind of 3D vision setup or similar. In this case, for 2D use, you're stuck at 60 hertz 1080p on HDMI 1.4. So then, can HDMI 2.0 do 1080p at a higher frequency, like 120 or 144 hertz? Well, if we do the math again on 1080, 1920 by 1080 times 60, or times 120, you can see that the pixel rate actually fits within the allowance, the headroom provided by the pixel clock and the throughput potential of the 3 TMDS channels. However, there are a lot of things in flux here, and just because it fits within that specification doesn't mean that you're going to get 120 hertz, 144 hertz on your new monitor. So here's the things to look out for. First of all, The video card has to support HDMI 2.0. A lot of video cards do not support this, including some newer ones. The monitor itself, or device, whatever the receiving device is, receiving the output from the video card, must not only support HDMI 2.0, but it has to support it at the frequency and resolution that you desire. So you need to check the manufacturer's specifications page and see if it's within the spec. One big and important note, you do not need a so-called HDMI 2.0 cable because the cable itself didn't change, and that's something that's true for a lot of interface updates where SATA, for example, SATA uses the same cable for SATA 3, SATA 2, SATA 1. They all perform the same, they all have the same throughput. It's just the interface that matters on the component and the device through which you are transmitting your data. So HDMI 2.0 cables, quote unquote, are not necessary for setting up an HDMI 2.0 device. Now in general, it is very uncommon for displays to support a higher frequency output using HDMI at any resolution, so we strongly recommend using DisplayPort or DVI dual link cables for your higher refresh rate needs when you're gaming. And ultimately, HDMI is more of a consumer interface. It's more meant and was originally built for things like TVs and viewing things where you don't need a very high refresh rate generally. And for gaming, you're going to want to use DisplayPort, which is still rising, gaining market share very rapidly, or DVI dual link. And even though DVI feels old at this point, dual link cables, which we have another video about, have a very high throughput potential, and that allows them to do the higher frequencies like 120 hertz at 1080, for example. To make sure a cable you buy is actually dual link DVI, you need to check our previous video. Just search the channel for DVI, you should find it, because the fatter cables are the ones that are DVI dual link. The skinnier DVI cables are not going to be dual link, even if sometimes they're sold on Amazon or Newegg as such. And the reason they can get away with calling a single link DVI cable dual link is because they'll have the pins in the header, but they're not wired. So that means it's not going to work. But that's another discussion. That's in our previous video. As far as HDMI, no, HDMI 1.4 does not support 120 hertz without using 3D. So in 2D, you don't get 120 hertz at 1080. That answers that. HDMI 2.0 primarily supports higher resolutions like 4K at 60. And then if you want anything else, you need to very closely look at your video card, and then the monitor itself must support whatever it is you're seeking. So check on a per device basis. Don't just assume that HDMI 2.0 is going to get the job done, because it's not really that simple when it comes to this particular interface. That is all for this video. Hit the Patreon link in the post roll if you like this kind of content and help us out. We picked up, I think, 2 new Patreon backers rather, in the last couple of days here. So huge thanks to those of you who have contributed. Helps us do awesome things like this right behind me, and stay independent in our production. So that's all for this time. I will see you all next time.